I'm Kim Posel. Today I'm going to be discussing gender inequality and global crisis, examining the disparities in women's rights and the effect on larger global issues. The topic of gender inequality seems like it should be one that is placed firmly in the history books, especially in the United States, where citizens have been forced to face important women's issues through a series of historical movements: suffrage, feminism, and in recent years, Me Too. The United States has women in space, women in Congress, women in the Supreme Court, and women leading large corporations. The women of the world make up nearly half the global population at 49.6%, and in some countries such as Poland, Germany, Zimbabwe, Argentina, and the United States, females exceed the male population. They are the mothers of every generation. They are the birthers, the raisers, the feeders, and the guiders of every single human that has ever lived. Yet they have not acquired the recognition or respect commensurate with the service and experience they provide to the world. In this presentation, I will identify just a few of the issues facing and damaging women worldwide. First, I will scrutinize systems in place that allow women to face pay disparities and discrimination in the workplace, in several workplaces. I will present affirmation to the idea that it should not happen and the practices that allow it to happen are harmful and unnecessary. Second, I will look at the small numbers of women in legislative leadership around the globe. The female population is continuously fighting for laws that protect their health and bodies, but only a small percentage of women serve in the legislative roles that help define these laws. I will offer an argument that presents statistics and precedent as evidence that this leaves the global population with a shortfall of perspective. Third, I will approach the issue of women facing violence. Women and girls still live in communities that allow violence and sexual assault on a daily basis, leaving them vulnerable to several additional issues of abuse and injustice, resulting in communities at large and generations of families left in shambles. Lastly, I will assess the role of education and where, by example, it falls short for girls and women around the world. Education is continuously more promoted and more accessible to men, and women are being left behind or outright excluded, leading to a plethora of vulnerable gaps in our global civilization. These are some of the issues that face women in the poor countries of Africa and Asia, and they also face the women in wealthy nations such as Canada and the United States. But we as a total population are facing enormous issues such as climate change and pandemic-level disease. The nations of this planet also always somewhere seem poised for war. In watching this presentation, I hope you are able to assess that our global society needs to achieve success and solution in addressing these injustices against women, and that the female gender must attain a level of recognition through a change in law and culture that they are necessary and equal contributors in our world community. The way that our greater world society treats women is reflective of the way the world treats people in general, and it's this idea to think others as inferior that has led and continues to lead to so many global crises. It is my belief that changing the way that society treats and considers women will improve society as a whole. And in this presentation, I hope to broach the following consideration for you. What if we can improve the situations of women across the world, offer them balance and safety, education and free will? What then becomes of some of these other impending dooms on the planet? There has been a long debate in the United States regarding college and high school sports. Football has long been a frontrunner in receiving the most funding, as it is considered a moneymaker sport at the high school and college level. It hasn't gone unnoticed by critics that football has also primarily been considered a male-only sport. Women's Division I sports, in contrast, receive half what men's Division I college sports receive, including funds to recruit women to college sports, and thus funds recruiting women to college. Again, some of the reasoning behind this discrepancy has long been rationalized as, quite simply, men's sports make more money than women's sports. However, in 2016, the acceptance of this argument was challenged when members of the four-time World Cup champion, four-time Olympic gold medalist U.S. women's soccer, filed a complaint that they were being grossly underpaid compared to U.S. men's soccer, whom had yet to win a World Cup championship or an Olympic gold medal. The challenge also included the argument that U.S. women's soccer games had generated more total revenue than the games of the U.S. men's soccer. In addition, the popularity of women's players such as Mia Hamm, Abby Wambach, and Megan Rapinoe cannot be denied as their likenesses adorn all types of revenue-earning merchandise. Yet, even at a time when women's soccer was in its most popular and money-making era, the merit of their contributions failed to be recognized as equal to the worth of the less successful men's national team by the U.S. Soccer Federation. The U.S. men's soccer team made more than twice the salary of the women. A similar case has been made of the pay gaps women in Hollywood are facing, with Forbes reporting in 2020 that the top 3 earning actresses and their salaries, Sofia Vergara, $43 million, Angelina Jolie, $35.5 million, Gal Gadot, $31.5 million, earned considerably less than their male counterparts. Dwayne Johnson, $87.5 million, Ryan Reynolds, $71.5 million, and Mark Wahlberg, $58 million. The argument in response to this discrepancy is simple. Male-led movies make more money than female-led movies. But data doesn't always support that conclusion. In fact, in an analysis done by the Creative Arts Agency measuring 350 movies between the years of 2014 to 2017, the female-led films outperformed the male-led movies in total global box office revenue. Films that passed the Bechdel test, a measure of the representation of women in movies, specifically if 2 female characters have a conversation about something other than a man, earned more revenue at the box office than films that failed this test. We also need to include in this conversation family films and animated films. Should the male lead make more than a female lead in an animated movie which markets to children and by proxy, mothers? Disney's 2013 animated mega hit Frozen set records, and its subsequent sequel Frozen 2 has made $1.325 billion since its release, and sits as the highest grossing animated film in history. Both movies were led by female actresses. If such a flagrant disparity exists in regards to some of the most celebrated women in sports and film, then consider what women in other professions and in other countries must be facing. In the United States in 2019, full-time working women earned only 82% of what full-time working men earned according to the U.S. Census Bureau. Globally, women make up almost 70% of the healthcare workforce, but earn 24% less than the men in that field. Contributions to the gap include accessibility to education, maternity penalizations, and an overrepresentation of men in higher paying positions and a higher representation of women in lower paying positions. Also, during the COVID-19 pandemic, women were disproportionately affected, as they were more likely to lose their jobs, with many of those jobs requiring in-person work or requiring mothers to be home with their families due to lack of childcare. Women also took on the added unpaid tasks of administering remote schooling for their families. Of note, in the United States, women hold the majority of essential jobs in healthcare, education, sales, and as office workers. Similarly, when looking at Asia's textile industry, where women make up most of the workforce, a tremendous gap can be seen, with women earning 64 cents to the dollar less in Pakistan and 34 cents to the dollar less in India. Chinese women benefited from a closing wage gap in the early 1980s due to the government making gender equality a priority, but for several reasons that progress has been lost today. There is a decline in state-supported child care services and a decreasing trend for families living multi-generationally, situations which would otherwise help with child care. So, more women are staying home to care for their children, leaving less women participating in the workforce of China. China also has seen a rise in the services sector of the economy, which employs more women at lower wages, as well as a decline in the goods sector, which has historically employed more men at higher wages. In fact, China ranks 106th out of 153 as one of the countries with the worst gender wage gap. In looking at fields where 70% or more of the workforce is women, one could say that women are doing most of the work for less of the pay. In India, education is a major contributing factor to another one of the worst gender pay gaps in the world. Women have a lower status than men culturally. Because women receive a less sufficient education compared to Indian men, they are less likely to attain higher paying jobs. Most Indian women work in the low-paying jobs within agriculture. Pakistan has the worst gender wage gap in the world. Like India, Pakistan has a lower view of women and relegates many of them to childcare, elderly care, and housework. This leaves Pakistani women with little time for job training or formal education. Very few women are involved in STEM-related fields, and the ones that are often experience workplace harassment. Pakistani women make up 90% of the bottom 1% of wage earners in their country. Interestingly, in Rwanda, one of the world's poorest countries, the gender pay gap is closing. In a report done by the World Economic Forum, 86% of the national workforce is female, a situation created by the 1994 genocide that killed more than 800,000 Rwandans and forced Rwandan women to fill jobs that men once possessed. The women's population rose 60 to 70% after the genocide, and the women of Rwanda began a movement in the workforce that mirrored the American women of World War II. They picked up the jobs that men were not there to fulfill, but unlike our grandmothers of the 1940s, the female workforce of Rwanda kept their jobs long past the era in which they inherited them. Signaling a recognition for the value of women's labor, a new constitution was passed in 2003 in Rwanda that addressed several women's rights issues, leading to 48% of the parliamentary seats being attained by women. That number has since risen to 61.5%. Today, Rwandan women earn 88 cents for every dollar that men earn and are recognized as a necessity to Rwandans' workforce. Their numbers and position in society poise them in a spot to influence change for women in their country. However, household attitudes towards the roles of women in Rwanda have yet to completely turn over, and feminism is still considered somewhat taboo as a whole. While things are still by no means equal in Rwanda, as the culture still has not caught up to the progress that's been made, the rise of the women in Rwanda and how they ultimately stepped up to save their country's economy and the benefits that came from that should offer insight as we study the benefits of women equality in other nations and cultures. When Rwanda needed workers, the women answered that call. In doing so, the perceived value of Rwandan women was forcibly reevaluated by the needs of workers. There is still a need to change attitudes towards the traditional roles that women have always held in Rwandan society, so that the women of Rwanda can continue their advancement in the workplace and make the necessary positive changes using their unique perspective. Using the examples of soccer salaries, if a woman was serving as the head of the U.S. Federation of Soccer, would a different perspective be applied when comparing the success and the value of the members of the two teams? Women also have a vested interest and plenty of reasons to become more participatory in the workplace, as they do in politics, legislative roles, and higher office. With the looming amount of laws that govern women's bodies, families, freedoms, and opportunities, it only benefits society as a whole to have women hold more leadership in government positions. The delicate insight that is necessary to properly evaluate the needs of the female half of the population cannot be found from men any more than a white man can properly determine the needs of a Native American. In the case of Rwanda, women have been recognized enough to have a small but growing foothold on the government in which they live, but they are still not fully or equally represented. In Iran, the number of women presented in parliament, also known as the Islamic Consultative Assembly, is only 6%. The lack of women represented in lawmaking roles have left women's rights in Iran pretty vacant. Many laws are oppressive towards the female population and offer little possibility for progress. The minimum age for girls to marry is 13 years old. Women can only marry once, with permission of the male head of the household. Widows are only entitled to 1/8 of her husband's estate. Sons are entitled to twice the share of a daughter. Women in Iran need permission from their husbands to travel abroad. They cannot run for president or become a judge. Currently, Women in Iran must by law be covered head to toe, covering their body and head with a traditional hijab. It is a law that is currently being heavily contested by the women of Iran, with protests erupting throughout the country as of September 2022. Women are casting off their head coverings in protest of this law and so many of the other laws that deny Iranian women the most basic of freedoms. But with limited roles allowed for women in government, there is a long, hard fight ahead, beginning with the attitudes towards women and their perceived roles in society. In the United States, women may delight with greater freedoms than the women of Iran. They may not cover their heads unless they are at the baseball field, at the beach, or perhaps in the church pews, but, like Iran, the female representation in government is also falling short. In the U.S. Senate, only 24% are women, and in the House of Representatives, only 28.3% are women. In the 2022 election cycle, some of the leading issues demanding answers from ambitious politicians were that which pertained to women, including abortion, wage gaps, discrimination, sexual assault, and violence. This same election cycle also saw the elections of a record number of women for the positions of governor, 12, set to serve in 2023, with 3 states, Arkansas, Massachusetts, and New York, electing their first female governor ever. And while the excitement of this may seem to point to something of a pink wave, so to speak, in the United States, those figures are still low for a group that, again, makes up more than half of the population. In fact, the United States is way down on the list at number 75 when looking at countries with the most female representation in their legislature. Worldwide, the figures are equally low. Merely 26.1% of women globally hold legislative roles. Canada and the United Kingdom are number 44 and number 59, respectively. The US, Canada, and the UK are long considered modern, wealthy, and progressive countries, but all still hold certain preconceived and outdated notions when it comes to what role or how big of a role women should have in government. Certainly, tradition and culture can influence women's path to holding higher office. Women in Saudi Arabia were only given the right to vote in 2011, and plenty of other countries, especially those in the Middle East, have been slow to allow women voting access. Sri Lanka, in contrast, elected the world's first female prime minister as early as 1960, only to produce little modern representation for women in their current government. Women, though, have found plenty of proven success when elected to legislative or higher office and have translated that success into big benefits for the people they serve. Liberia elected Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in 2005 by winning the support of over 80% of the women voters. It was a revolution that included fed-up mothers, grandmothers, victims of abuse, and young women from a country that had just come through a vicious 15-year civil war that Sirleaf helped to end. In England, Margaret Thatcher famously served as Prime Minister for 3 consecutive terms through the 1980s, arguably lowering inflation, cutting down labor unions, creating legislation to offer affordable housing, and navigating through war and world conflict. Vigdis Finnbogadóttir historically won her election in 1980 to become Iceland's first female head of state, and bringing to light for the first time many of the issues that are still discussed today: wage gaps, maternity leave, discrimination. Finnbogadóttir's election changed the landscape of voting in Iceland as it fueled more of the female demographic to participate, and she was elected 3 additional times, either unopposed or winning 96% of the vote. And her time in office serves as an example of how women in politics can change the landscape of government for the better. First elected in 1966, Indira Gandhi was elected multiple times as India's Prime Minister, most notably leading a war against Pakistan and putting India in opposition of Pakistan backer and sitting U.S. President Richard Nixon in support of independence for the people that would eventually become the country of Bangladesh. She would later be assassinated as she served her 4th term in office. Indira Gandhi, having served her country respectably and unremittingly, met a violent end. Gandhi was assassinated by 2 of her own bodyguards in what is suspected to be retribution for her political decisions. Violence against women in African countries is rampant, including women in parliament. Intimidation and harassment using psychological, physical, and sexual abuse has been reported by women serving in legislative posts in 50 African countries, received mostly from their male colleagues in attempts to dissuade them from political participation. The statistics of violence against African girls and women in general is daunting, with endless cases of rape and child marriage marring most progress in women's causes. Gender-based violence in Liberia has risen 50% in just the beginning of 2020, and in just 6 months' time, 600 rape cases were reported. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, women and girls suffer the devastating consequences of conflict-related violence. Doctors Without Borders reported treating over 10,000 people for sexual violence and remarked, given the multiple obstacles survivors face when assessing care, from cost to fear of retaliation, this is the most likely just the tip of the iceberg. In Sudan, a country rife with violence against women, rape is now being used as a tool to discourage protest after resistance to a military coup broke out in the country in October 2021. As previously mentioned, the women of Iran are rising up against laws that limit their rights, and doing so in response to a young girl losing her life when Iran's morality police randomly decided she was not properly covered per law and arrested her. She mysteriously died in custody 3 days later. Laws in Iran and in several Middle Eastern countries that limit the rights of women have proven violent and life-threatening to the women they are inflicted upon. Saudi Arabian women are often trapped in a strict male guardianship system, known as mahram, requiring permission from a male to do most anything, but at worst, potentially leaving them in situations of domestic violence without reprieve. The United Nations reports that in Egypt, 92% of women and girls have experienced female genital mutilation. 92%. At least 37% of Arab women have experienced some sort of violence in their lifetime. In the United States, 1 in 5 women have been raped, and 1 in 4 women have been victims to severe physical violence in their lifetime, according to the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey conducted in 2010 by the Center for Disease Control. According to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, 72% of all murder-suicides involve an intimate partner, and 94% of these victims of murder are female. Unreported injuries, pregnancy, job loss, poverty, sexually transmitted disease, trauma, depression, and suicide are all results of violence against women in the United States, and only the situations worsen when looking deeper into ethnic and Native communities. Police and court responses have been inadequate, and these cases are very hard to prosecute, mainly due to the fear of reporting abuse, leaving women vulnerable to continued violence and risk. Again, these situations only worsen in ethnic and Native communities, and these cases often lead to generational repetition where children are affected. Birth, abuse, repeat. Birth, abuse, repeat. In the United States, arguably one of the most dangerous places for a young woman to be is on a college campus. Sexual assault, harassment, and stalking are some of the things that put a young woman at risk when she begins her undergraduate career at any U.S. university, and some surveys state that more than 20% of undergraduate women have suffered some type of sexual misconduct. Campus safety has become such a hot topic that many universities have started tackling the problem by conducting programs on consent. These programs are geared towards male students with the intentions of changing for the better the way that women are viewed and considered on campus. Problems persist. In Japan, higher education has been plagued with scandals of test tampering meant to exclude women. The BBC reported in August 2018 that prestigious Tokyo Medical University changed entrance exam scores so that no more than 30% of accepted applicants would be women. In Tokyo, 80% of public high schools require higher exam scores for girls than boys seeking admission. Higher scores are required of girls in order to accommodate a gender quota that has been imposed, a gender quota that now exists to protect boys from the girls that are outperforming them in testing. The result is girls failing their admission tests based on their gender alone. Japanese culture struggles with sexism in general. In 2021, former Prime Minister Yoshiro Mori resigned from his post as head of the Tokyo Olympics after he was quoted as saying women talk too much, and signaled that having meetings with many female board members would take a lot of time. A week later, Japan's Liberal Democratic Party announced that they would invite women lawmakers to observe their all-male board meeting, but they would not be allowed to speak. In a report released by UNICEF, girls are 2.5 times more likely to be out of schools in countries affected by conflict. Several African countries, Niger, Mozambique, and Central African Republic, among others, also have high rates of child marriage disproportionately affecting girls in receiving an education. In India, 40% of women are married before the age of 18. In Iran, girls are married as young as age 13. Girls that marry young are less likely to complete or continue schooling. In countries affected by conflict and violence, adolescent pregnancies as a result of violence impact young girls and their ability to receive an education. In some cases, the lack of schooling contributes to the overall violence in the communities and helps to solidify the inequalities that face these girls. Poverty is also a big contributor in keeping children out of school, but because of social norms that are locked in place, poverty affects girls and young women at a higher rate. School is expensive, whether a person is living in sub-Saharan Africa, Japan, Canada, or the United States. Men have been identified in several cultures to carry out the role of breadwinner, and as such, the investment into their education has been justified over that of women whose traditional roles fall into the category of caretaking and homemaking. In the case of Japan's medical school, a justification for withholding admission to women is based on whether they will pursue a medical practice after graduation, thus giving back to the economy, versus getting married and having a family. Instead of making the Friday night football game the most popular event of the week, let's experiment with cheering on the high school girls' soccer team. We will eliminate any visual advertisements regarding the underperforming boys' football team and instead replace the posters with those that cheer on the non-defeated girls' team. Quality t-shirts will be made with a variety of high-end designs to entice fans. Girls' soccer will be the booster club's top priority, as it raises funds throughout the town, allowing the purchasing of fancy uniforms and inflatable game tunnels. The school band will play at every game to elevate the energy. Let's experiment with making those soccer games the most exciting event in town. Tickets will be sold. People will be turned away at the door. The schools will count all of the money that they have earned in ticket sales, merchandise, and food, and they will bravo their wise investment. Recruiters will line the field looking for the next big college star. Then, let's experiment the same way at the college level. Let's experiment with young women being heavily recruited for college, given scholarships to play soccer and receive an education, with ESPN televising every soccer game. The national women's team will kick across our screens as we watch from home with every Monday night soccer broadcast. Soccer fans will yell in jubilation as the home team takes gold at the Olympics. Our professional women athletes will score big with fat paychecks and endorsement deals because, let's imagine, our society won't be told what sport or gender is worth cheering for. Let's imagine it has finally happened. We've learned to cheer for women. Women need to be recognized as important and equivalent members in a global society that desperately requires their perspective, instinct, and intellect. In addition to the obvious anatomical differences between men and women, studies show that men and women also have very different personality traits. For example, women score higher in agreeableness and openness to experience, while men score higher in narcissism and lower in neuroticism. There are several programs throughout the world aimed at increasing female participation in math and science fields. There is no shortage of examples of women proving their equality and sometimes superiority in these fields. If Nobel Prize winner Marie Curie had conformed to her expected role in the home, the way we see and treat cancer might be very different today. Her daughter Irene continued her mother's work, also rejecting the societal expectations of women. Katherine Johnson, NASA's superstar mathematician, made sure to step out of the kitchen to make sure John Glenn made it home from space. Hedy Lamarr stepped out of Hollywood's silver screen to pioneer the technology responsible for GPS and Bluetooth. Our planet is rife with challenges. COVID-19 took its toll and infectious disease isn't going anywhere. Climate change looms over every car, every ocean, every country, and every human. Land and power and those hungry for it will cause damage to our global citizens. Our coming generations are faced with problems that they will inherit, and all hands are needed on deck. Immanuel Kant's philosophy on human rights is based on the respect of the individual, and the individual is deserving of freedom and dignity. Aren't women deserving of these freedoms? Shouldn't women of all cultures in all societies, born into any situation, be worthy of dignity in her life, despite her lot? Don't we as a global society want these free, worthy women raising free and worthy children, and so on? And don't we need the knowledge of these women? Rich, poor, women of all communities, to address the continuing issues that afflict the nations of the world? The answer should be yes. Yes, yes, and yes. We absolutely need the women of the world. They are the birthers, and the raisers, and the feeders, and the guiders. So we need to value and protect every single one. Generations of outdated thinking needs to be transformed into generations of progressive thinking. All perspectives, all ideas, the thinkers, the dreamers, the doers will be required to solve poverty and conflict. It is through changing the way the world sees women, then inclusively governs women in particular, that we can begin to experience balance and progress in so many of the problems facing our greater community, problems that require the intelligence and attention of the entire population.